Good morning or afternoon. We are so happy to have you join us today. I am coming to you from sunny Fontana, California, and it is hot out here. We are headed towards 90 degrees. What is the weather like where you are? I'm Linda Williams, a community outreach and training manager with Consumer Action, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on the CDC's order to halt evictions. The coronavirus has impacted all our lives, but as a response to the housing crisis caused by income loss due to tons of jobs being lost due to COVID 19 and to help slow the spread of the coronavirus, the CDC announced a nationwide order to halt evictions. But is this a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, there's lots of confusion about this order, such as what does the CDC order do? Who does it protect? I know you have tons and tons of questions. We have a great webinar planned for you today. Our guest speaker is Ms. Bridgett Simmons. She is an attorney with the National Housing Law Project. We got the best for you, so you are in for a treat. After her overview of the order, which will include updates on a Q&A that was released by the CDC on Friday, we will have a question and answer segment that where you can not only ask the questions that you have about the order, but we want to hear about your concerns and we want to hear about what you are seeing on the ground in the communities that you serve. But before we get started, get into today's presentation, I need to go over a few housekeeping items. First, today's webinar is part of a series of webinars that Consumer Action is hosting in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So on behalf of the entire staff at Consumer Action, I would like to thank all of our funders, all of our funders for their generous support of the COVID-19 educational project. That support has allowed us to reach thousands of consumers and advocates across the U.S. Now, as the announcer stated when you joined the webinar, you are in listen only mode. However, if you have questions, and we hope you have tons and tons of questions, you can use the question function on the right of your screen to type in your questions. Please take a minute, find that function, click on it, open it up so you are ready to go. If you're on Twitter, if you're using that platform, you can ask your questions on that platform. Our organization handle is Ask Consumer Action, and you can use our go-to hashtag, which is CA Webinars. My colleague, Nelson Santiago, he's going to facilitate the question and answer segment following Ms. Simmons' presentation. So he's busy. He will be busy capturing all of your questions, including those on Twitter. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you along with any handouts tomorrow afternoon via a Dropbox. Now, you don't need to have a Dropbox. We are providing the Dropbox. All you will need to do is click on the link that we send you in order to get the materials. Now, at the end of the training, you will receive a survey about today's webinar. Please, please, please complete that survey. We use the survey. The survey will help us continue doing the work that we are doing. So before you sign off, please complete the survey. So let me introduce you to Consumer Action. What is it that we do besides host webinars? Well, through education, as it says on the screen under Welcome to Consumer Action. Through education and advocacy, Consumer Action fights for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness, financial prosperity for underrepresented consumers nationwide. How do we do it? We advance consumer rights nationwide by referring complaints through our national hotline, by publishing education materials in multiple languages through our monthly newsletter, The Insider, and our quarterly presentation, CA News, and by advocating for consumers in the media and before lawmakers. We've been around since 1971. In fact, we just celebrated our 49th anniversary, and get ready 2021 because our 50th is going to be off the hook. Now, let me take a couple of seconds to show you how to download some of our free education materials because in this time of need, I'm sure your clients could use the information. Let's say you're like me and you're seeing a lot of cases regarding identity theft, more so than usual since the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And you're interested in a training module where you will you go to our website. The address is on all of the documents that you receive from us. When you're on our website, go over to the quick menu, go down to select a training module Once you're on there, scroll down till you see identity theft and account fraud and click, and it will lead you to a list of publications that we've created regarding identity theft. You will find a backgrounder's guide and question and answer format, a lesson plan with learning objectives and step-by-step instructions on how to use it, along with PowerPoint slides. And in the notes sections of the PowerPoint slides will be talking points, and there's also an identity theft quiz that I created that you can use, download, and engage your audience. Now, if you're interested in our COVID-19 project, click on the dark green bar at the bottom and you will land on our COVID-19 page. If you're interested in resource guides, you click on our resource guides and you will find valuable information for consumers impacted by the COVID-19 crisis in different languages. If you would like to look at some of our fact sheets, like the one to the right, making a job or a career transition, you click on the words fact sheets and that will come up. If you want some more information about the CDC's order, click on the evictions, the picture, and a alert that was created by my colleague Nelson Santiago will pop up, and it will have tons of information for you there. If you're interested in our previous past webinars, click on webinars and it will take you to all of the recordings of our past webinars. Now, we are a 501c3 organization and we are supported by membership, donations, and grants. At the end of the webinar, I will give you information on how you can donate. Now, let's take a look at our agenda. At Consumer Action, we believe in making learning fun. So we open every training by testing your knowledge on the topics of the training with one of our most popular games, How Much Do You Know? Following the game, we will move into our feature presentation. Following the feature presentation, a question and answer session led by my colleague Nelson Santiago will follow. And once we complete the question and answer segment, I will come back. I will tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action, and I will wrap up. So let's move into the game. Please launch the first poll question. Okay. Under the CDC's order, landlords cannot convict tenants for any reason if they meet income and other requirements. So is that true or is that false? Don't second guess it. Guess yourself. Come on. All right. Let's close the poll with the results. Oh, so 29% of you think it's true and 71% think it's false. With 71%, you are correct. That is false. Let's move to the next question, please. If state eviction protections are equal to or greater than CDC's order protections, tenants can still rely on state protections. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and see the results. Wow, 79% of you think that's true and only 21% think it's false. Actually, that's true. Let's move to the next question, please. To take advantage of the National Eviction Moratorium, tenants must live in properties with federally backed mortgages. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll and get the results. Oh wow. 23 only 23% thinks it's true and 77% thinks it's false. Well, it's false. Let's go to the last poll question. We're going to have to make these questions harder. Unless the CDC order is extended, tenants without additional state or local rights would have to pay past due rent in January. Is that true or is that false? Couple more seconds. Don't overthink it. Okay, let's close the poll and see the results. So 87% believe that it's true and only 13% thinks it's false. It's actually true. Payments, all of payments of back rent will be due in January unless that order is extended. Okay, well, thank you for participating in that poll. You did a fantastic job, but we're going to have to make these questions just a little bit harder. Okay, so let's move on. Let me introduce you to our guest speaker. That's the reason you're here. You want to hear her and not me. Our guest speaker today is Miss Bridgett A. Simmons. Miss Simmons is a 2017 graduate of Georgetown University Law Center, a 2011 graduate of Florida A&M University. While at Georgetown University Law Center, she participated in the Harrison Institute Affordable Housing Transaction Clinic, assisting district residents in operating a multi-family housing property purchase via the Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act. The focus of Ms. Simmons' work at the National Housing Law Project is on the preservation of HUD-subsidized multifamily housing, healthy housing, and voucher use. Ms. Simmons joined the National Housing Law Project in September 2017 as the second David B. Bryson Fellow. As a Bryson Fellow, Ms. Simmons managed the editing process of the fifth edition of the HUD Housing Program Tenants' Rights Book, also known as the Green Book, which is a treaty on the laws governing HUD housing program. And as a side note, when I was an advocate with the Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles, that Green Book was my Bible. So without further ado, let me turn this presentation over to Ms. Simmons, if I can find my, just one quick second. Where is my cursor? Oh, here it is. One second. Okay, Ms. Simmons, take it away.
Thank you so much, and hello to everyone. So first, I want to thank Consumer Action for inviting NHLP to join today's broadcast to discuss the CDC moratorium. The National Housing Law Project is a national organization based in San Francisco, California. We provide technical assistance to attorneys who represent clients in federally subsidized housing. We also provide policy support, or we do advocacy in and around affordable housing policies and policies to increase access to housing opportunities throughout the country, so at the federal, state, and local level. And as mentioned before, I'm a staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project, and my portfolio primarily consists of working on multifamily property issues, but I also work with vouchers as well as healthy housing and tenant organizing. So on September 4th, the CDC put into place a national eviction moratorium, citing its authority to take action to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. Typically, the federal laws do not help to determine if someone can be evicted, except if that unit is federally subsidized or where there are fair housing issues. Landlord-tenant law is largely a function of state and local law. Eviction hearings are primarily heard by state judges or justice of the peace. I say all of that to say the CDC order is being implemented, and how the CDC order is being implemented and enforced throughout the country will look different because the order itself that the CDC published, it doesn't have many details. And so last week, the CDC issued guidance on the order. Unfortunately, that guidance did not provide additional clarity, but actually muddied the water for folks' understanding of the CDC order and what it requires. So today I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all, or to chat with you all, to talk about the CDC moratorium and how it can be used to keep folks safely housed at home. I would also note that the CDC moratorium is just one of several tools that can be used to prevent an eviction, and that state and local law is still relevant. And so knowing what the lay of the land is in your area is going to be quite vital. So a little bit more about the CDC moratorium. As I mentioned, the CDC put into place a nationwide moratorium. The CDC order prohibits a landlord, an owner of a residential property, or any other person with the legal right to pursue an eviction from evicting any covered person from a residential property where the CDC order applies. And so in a moment, we'll further unpack what some of these terms mean. And I just want to note, moving forward, just as a shorthand, I'm going to say landlords, but when I say landlords, I'm referring to landlords, owners, agents, and any other person with the legal right to pursue eviction. So the CDC order does allow, as one of the poll questions indicated, the CDC order does allow for some evictions to continue based on specific conduct, and we'll discuss those particular situations shortly. So taking a couple of steps back, most folks were really surprised that the CDC was the federal agency issuing this nationwide eviction. And so I just really want to highlight and keep in mind that the CDC is acting under its authority to prevent the spread of disease. So the CDC, in its order, it describes how evictions will further spread COVID-19. For instance, it puts stress on the infrastructures and communities that try to rehouse folks that are homeless. Also, if folks are evicted, they may have to move into close quarters with families and friends, and those close quarters would not allow them to properly social distance, right? And so the CDC really talks about how evictions and the threat of evictions will potentially exacerbate the public health concerns of COVID-19. So the eviction moratorium went into effect in September 4th, and it will be in place until the end of the year. But the CDC can choose to extend the moratorium. And another very important piece is that the moratorium does not waive the obligation to pay rent. In fact, the eviction moratorium requires that covered persons must make best efforts to pay a portion of their rent in a timely manner. Additionally, landlords can still charge fees for late and non-payment of rent. And while they can charge those fees, they cannot evict covered persons for not paying those fines and fees. So under the CDC order, owners and their agents are prevented from evicting covered persons from a residential property. So the order is focused on the owner's actions and prohibits owners and their agents from acting in a way to evict someone. The order defines eviction and evict as any action taken that would lead or result in the removal of a covered person from a residential property. In its recently published FAQ, the CDC states that the order prohibits the actual eviction of a covered person, meaning covered persons are still protected from an eviction, the physical removal from the property. And so in most cases, state law will also prohibit landlords from filing an eviction action prior to January 1st. During this time of the CDC order being in place, the landlord may not take any action to physically remove a covered person such as causing a court order eviction to be carried out, harassing or intimidating a tenant to vacate. Where state law allows for it, a landlord can file an eviction, but cannot take any steps to have the tenant removed. So once the covered person gives the declaration to their landlord or to any other agent acting on behalf of the landlord, that's what triggers the protection. And the tenant can continue to be in possession of the unit until the expiration of the CDC order. And then, as I mentioned before, the CDC order lists 5 situations in which the landlord is permitted to evict a covered person. So we have them listed here on this slide. And in all of these situations, it involves either tenant misconduct or the tenant's breach of the lease. So in particular, I would just flag this last situation in which folks can be evicted, even though they've submitted the declaration, and that's when folks violate their contractual obligation, other than non-payment of fees, rents, penalties, and interest, and other things of the sort. So what type of properties are covered? The moratorium applies in every state and territory except for America Samoa. And so it doesn't apply in America Samoa because they haven't had any cases, but if there are reported COVID cases, it would then apply there. Additionally, the order doesn't apply in states and local areas where they have instituted public health protections that are the same or more protective than the CDC order. So the relevant courts that are interpreting the CDC order will determine if the CDC order is more protective than the state or local protections. So the CDC order applies to all residential housing, whether it's subsidized or not. The moratorium applies to all residential units. So if someone is a commercial renter, this doesn't apply to them. So what is a residential rental unit? This includes it includes houses, apartments, mobile homes, or land in a mobile park that is used for dwelling purposes. However, the order is explicit in that it excludes rentals used by temporary guests or seasonal tenants, and temporary guests and seasonal tenants are defined under state and local law. The CDC order, and what we've been trying to stress about the CDC order is that it's a floor, meaning that the protections contained in the CDC order, like that's any protections enacted by the state or the local government can't be any lower than what's in the CDC order. So courts have to, at the minimum, folks should be receiving the protections of the CDC order. And so states and local jurisdictions can actually enact additional protections, and they should, but just really want to emphasize that what's in the CDC order is the minimum. And so finally, the other thing that I want to note is that if a property has a federally backed mortgage that is in forbearance, the residents living at that property may enjoy additional protections. So who is protected under the CDC order? I've been using this phrase covered person. So a covered person is an individual who is a tenant, leasee, or a resident of a residential property who submits the signed declaration to their landlord, and that signed declaration is submitted sworn under the penalty of perjury, and it indicates that that person meets the following. That person has used their best efforts to obtain all available government assistance for rent or housing, that person meets the income eligibility restrictions as listed here on the slide, that the person cannot pay the full rent because of a substantial loss of income, loss of employment or work hours, or have extraordinary out-of-pocket medical expenses. And also the person has to indicate that they will make best efforts to make timely partial payments for the rent that are close to the full payment of rent. And so that partial payment is in consideration of the individual's ability to pay, considering their other non-discretionary expenses. And then finally, if a person is evicted that they believe that they would become homeless or would need to be housed at a homeless shelter or to share a residence with a large number of other folks in a small space. So getting back to this idea that evictions lead to stressors on our homeless service providers, as well as sharing close quarters would not allow folks to safely social distance at home. So in all of the states, once a tenant has sent the declaration to their landlord, the tenant may remain in the premise, so in the property, until at least January 1st, even if they're delinquent in rent. And so once again, the CDC order is in place until the end of the year, but the CDC may choose to extend it. But as of right now, these protections end on January 1st. There is no deadline for submitting the declaration, except that the declaration has to be submitted prior to any last action by the owner. So I previously mentioned the CDC order focuses on owner action. It's prohibiting owner action to evict, to remove someone. So someone who wants to submit the declaration would need to submit the declaration before any final act the owner has to take to remove someone from a unit. So what does this mean? For example, if someone who was evicted from a unit and they physically left the unit, if they then submit the declaration to that landlord, it's likely that they would be unsuccessful in asserting that they are protected by the CDC order, because at that point, they're already out of the unit. The owner doesn't have to take another action to keep them out of the unit or to remove them from the unit. So determining when to submit the declaration will be based on a number of individual considerations. For instance, will the family be able to give a partial payment during that period in which they've submitted the declaration? Are there other state and local protections that the family can use prior to submitting the declaration? And so the CDC, along with its order, they included as an attachment a declaration form. But I want to, flag that covered persons are not required to use the declaration form that is attached to the order. They only need to use a similar form. That form needs to contain the same information, so that the form used by the person needs to say that they meet these 5 eligibility points. The form also needs to include the language regarding the person acknowledging that they're submitting the declaration subject to perjury. And then the other thing I'll say about the declaration is that the CDC encourages every adult on the lease to submit the declaration if they meet the eligibility requirements. But that is not mandated. So one adult that's on the lease could submit one declaration on behalf of all adults, and that should suffice. So what stage does the eviction moratorium prevent? So landlords, once again, I keep saying this like a broken record. Landlords cannot evict any covered person from a residential property. And the order defines evict and eviction as any action the owner takes to remove or causes the removal of a covered person from the property. So once again, in all states, once a tenant has submitted the declaration form to their landlord, the tenant may remain in the premise until January 1st, 2021, even if they're delinquent in rent. During that time period, the landlord may not take any action to physically remove the tenant, such as causing a court order eviction to be carried out or harassing or intimidating a tenant to vacate. So some states, I mentioned at the top of this presentation that the implementation and enforcement of the CDC order is going to be different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and it's kind of because of the recent guidance the CDC provided, and because the order itself doesn't include, the order itself is not deep in detail, I like to phrase it that way, if the protections of the CDC order are a little uneven throughout the country. And so some states are going to allow landlords to file an eviction, even though our reading of the CDC order is that they should not be permitted to do that. But where landlords can file an eviction, they cannot take any steps to remove the tenant. So if anything that you get from me today is like, once someone submits the declaration form, they should be able to continue to physically remain in the unit until January 1st, 2021. And so, oh, I did have another slide, but that's fine. Okay, so what type of evictions are still permissible under the CDC order? So the CDC order lists 5 instances in which an eviction can continue through all the way up to removal of the covered person from the unit. So so I have the 5 listed here. All of the listed instances involve either tenant misconduct or a breach of the tenant's lease obligations. The order does not waive any contractual obligation. So once again, folks are still obligated to pay rent. It just delays the owner's ability to seek an eviction for non-payment of rent. So folks are still obligated to pay rent. Folks are still obligated to keep any of the lease requirements. So I say that to say a covered person can be evicted for violating any other contractual obligations. And this can be problematic for several reasons, but in particular, where folks do not have a copy of their written lease. And it's important that for those people that they will either one, get a copy of their written lease, but also understanding what the terms of their tenancy require of them. And then the only other thing I'll say about these 5 instances is that, you know, although they are facially neutral, this carve out of where evictions can be carried out could be used to target families that are considered troubled by the housing provider. So if the housing provider considers the family to be a trouble family, they could use one of these 5 instances to try to evict the family. And, you know, although facially neutral, it could be used as a tool to mischaracterize typical renter behavior. So I think we also have to keep in mind these are 5 instances in which folks can be evicted, but could still be used, could be abused. So what happens January 1st, 2021? Presently, the CDC order is set to expire at the end of the year. And so on January 1st, 2021, landlords will be able to pursue an eviction, physically remove tenants or have tenants physically removed from the unit if they've already been granted a judicial eviction on January 1st. And so, you know, and so on January 1st, unless the state or local government have their own eviction moratorium in place or have other protections in place. So in jurisdictions where there are no protections, everything that we've been putting off will happen on January 1st, 2021. And so what I'll say here is that Congress, HUD, the VA, the USDA, they all have the authority to enact a moratorium. So in addition to the CDC having the authority or the ability to extend its current order, these other federal actors can also institute an eviction moratorium. I will say, in terms of the possibility of that happening before January 1st, it doesn't look likely, unfortunately. So what happens with folks' rent? So once again, if there are no state and local protections regarding past due rent, folks might have to have all of that past due rent ready to give to the landlord on January 1st. And so in some jurisdictions, folks will not need to have all the money on January 1st, but this is once again an area or a time when knowing what is happening locally will help to determine when that back due rent will become, when folks will need to pay that back due rent to their landlord. And so all jurisdictions should have some type of rental assistance program. And the rental assistance program can help folks pay past due rent. And so each rental assistance program is structured differently. And so in some instances, they'll be able to cover all of the past due rent, but in most instances, they probably will not be able to cover all of the past due rent, just a portion. And then the only other thing I would say is that in the CDC order, as well as HUD and the other federal agencies, they're really encouraging landlords and tenants to develop repayment plans. So the folks are anticipating that covered persons will not have all of the back rent on January 1st. And so hoping that landlords and tenants can come to some type of agreement. So that's something that they've really been advocating for. But I would say landlords have no legal obligation to enter into a repayment plan unless there are state and local laws that require them to do so. And so before I wrap up, I just wanted to share some actions that we can all be thinking about. Local jurisdictions should be discouraging rather than encouraging landlords from evicting folks. And so at the local level, I've mentioned that it's local courts that are enforcing and implementing the CDC order. And so local courts and jurisdictions, they really have the authority to say that any action that the landlord does will, any action that the landlord takes to have someone physically remove, or cause the removal of that person is prohibited by the CDC order. Also, the CDC order does not require anyone to tell residents of this protection. And so it's important that folks who learn of the CDC protection share it with others in our community. And then as like housing, those who live in federally subsidized housing, or housing where the tenant's portion of the rent is based on their income, that if they're struggling to pay rent, that the family seeks a interim recertification, because that interim recertification will allow them to pay rent commensurate with their ability to pay. So it'll decrease because they don't have the income to pay the higher rent. So where interim recertifications are available to folks, making sure that tenants have done that, especially the families that are submitting the declaration. Where possible, landlords and tenants should try to develop a repayment plan for the past due rent. But as I mentioned, the landlord really has no legal obligation unless there are state and then local laws that require them to try to develop a repayment plan. So in terms of the declaration, creating a safe space for submitting the declaration, and so safe space meaning not only physically safe, right? We're still in a public health pandemic, and COVID is spread through close interaction. So not only making a physical space, but also reassuring folks that the declaration will only be used for purposes of the CDC order. So we've heard in instances where folks who are in households that are mixed families, that there's fear that if they submit the declaration, that the landlord would report them to ICE or another federal agency, resulting in potential deportment, right? So just creating not only a physical space that's safe, but also a environment of safety. And then also sharing local resources, so tapping into legal infrastructure to represent those who are facing evictions or challenges to declarations. Tenants are typically not represented in eviction hearings, and landlords typically are represented in eviction hearings. And so that does impact the outcome of eviction hearings. I mentioned that the CDC order isn't deep in detail, and their current guidance has muddied the waters, which means that it's going to be difficult for tenants by themselves to assert their rights and the protections under the CDC order. And on this slide, I have a couple of links to websites that list legal service organizations throughout the country. And I would also say that some attorneys have been trying to do educational advocacy with the court, so providing bench cards about the CDC order and what it requires of folks. Also, when they go up before the court, in their defense of their client, asserting, what the CDC order of protections require. So, in addition to connecting folks with resources, other folks are also trying to do advocacy with the court about what the CDC order requires. And then the last thing I'll say about what we can all do here together and what we can be thinking about is, eviction moratoriums are very much an important tool. They keep people in their homes for a period of time. But because the CDC order does not include any type of rental assistance, because Congress has not passed or an additional relief bill, we're essentially kicking the can down the line, right? Because at some point, rent is going to be due. Rental assistance continues to be necessary to keep families housed safely and to slow the spread of COVID-19. So, we've been encouraging folks to reach out to their members of Congress to express to them the importance and the need for rental assistance. But, also some states and local jurisdictions might have money and resources that they can set aside to also help with rental assistance. And so, as I said, if there is no rental assistance, we're just delaying massive evictions until 2021. And so that's why rental assistance is so important. And then my last slide, I just wanted to provide you all with some resources. So in addition to the wonderful resources provided by Consumer Action, I've linked some of NHLP's resources in regards to the CDC order specifically, but also our COVID and housing resources. Also linked to our VAWA resources, because my understanding is that a number of you work with survivors. And, prior to the public health crisis, it was very difficult to assert VAWA rights. And so now being in this public health crisis, it's only heighten the difficulty in asserting borrower rights. And so the only thing I will say about our resources is because we provide technical assistance to attorneys, this is really written for an audience. Our resources are written for an audience of attorneys. But we do have some resources for tenants. In particular, for the CDC order, we have translations of the declaration, and folks can use those translated declarations to submit to property owners. And we also have flyers about the CDC order on our website, which are also translated. So I'll stop there. Oh, the other thing is, here is my contact information. I am, available to help answer any questions that we don't get to today. And I'll turn it back over.
Well, thank you, Ms. Simmons, for a great overview of that order. Nelson is going to handle our question and answer segment. So this is where we hear from you. We want to hear all of your questions, all of the concerns, and what you're seeing on the ground. Well, we got the expert here with us. Okay, so Nelson, do you have any questions?
Yes, we do. Thank you, Ms. Simmons. That was a wonderful presentation. Well, few people, we had about 3 or 4 questions related to subletters, people who may be subletting, perhaps with permission or without permission, even people who are maybe from another country and staying in an apartment with somebody. What kind of protections are available for these additional people living in the home?
Yeah, so someone who's subletting would be considered a covered person if they submit the declaration to the landlord or the owner of the property. So in order to avail yourself of the protections, you just have to be someone who is renting a residential space. So being a leasee, being, the leasee is the technical term for a renter. So that would also include anyone that's subletting. And that person who is subletting would need to submit that declaration to the owner of the property, to the management agency of the property, because once again, the order focuses on their behavior, on their actions taken to evict someone. And so, the declaration would be needed to be given to that person, to the owner or the management agency.
Okay, and just to clarify, if in a subletting situation, it's without the landlord's permission, the question is, can a tenant who sublets, I guess, without permission, be considered violating the contractual obligation, and thus both the tenant and the subletter can be evicted because there is no permission for that subletter to be there if they're not on the lease?
Yeah, I hate to speculate. That particular situation hasn't come up in our work with attorneys, but if it is a violation of the lease, then the original resident would likely be, the landlord would be likely to terminate the original lease if it's a violation of their lease. So that was a little convoluted. So essentially, if someone is violating their lease, the CDC order does say that the landlord can evict them. So in instances where there's a sublet that is in violation of the lease, then the original tenant could then be evicted, which would result in the termination of the sublease.
Okay, great. So definitely seek legal advice for that, right? Great, thank you so much. We had another question. Somebody said they attended another webinar with an attorney, and during that webinar, it was stated that a tenant that had left a property and appealed a court decision for eviction could possibly be allowed to return to the property if they raised the CDC defense. Have you heard any of that? Do you think that's true?
So going back to the point of the CDC order focuses on the owner's action. So for each individual case, they would have to determine if the owner has to take an additional action. So in some instances, the court has entered a decision in favor of the landlord, but the person hasn't been removed from the unit. So in that instance, the person is still in possession of the unit. They could still submit the declaration and be protected. Where I think it becomes difficult is where the person has been removed from the unit and the landlord now has possession of the unit. So I don't want to, give the impression that it's impossible to assert the CDC order and to avail yourself of the protections. I think it's just a lot more difficult once the tenant has given up possession of the unit, before giving the declaration. But certainly, an advocate could make other arguments saying that they should still be protected nonetheless.
Great, thank you very much. Someone is asking about the late fees and penalties, that whether they're waived or not, and what might be done about that.
So under the CDC order, landlords can continue to assess late fees. If, for instance, a local jurisdiction has a moratorium in place that says late fees could not be assessed, a court will have to decide if the local protections are more protective. So in that instance, I think it would be safe to say the local protections are more protective. And so then the landlord wouldn't be required or would not be able to charge late fees. So it depends on the interaction of the local law with the CDC order. But the CDC order by itself does allow landlords to assess late fees. So the other thing I would flag is that I mentioned during the presentation that folks who live in properties with federally backed mortgages that are in forbearance, they may have additional protections. And so in those instances, the property owner would not be able to assess late fees. So you have to look at a number of laws is the answer to that question.
Thank you. Someone is asking, and this I guess goes to the interaction of local laws and the federal law, if someone can apply for rent relief program offered by the state sort of as a one-shot deal and also get the protection from the CDC at the same time, or is it a separate process?
Yeah, so the CDC order, in order to be a covered person, one of the eligibility requirements is that the person, the tenant, has sought all government assistance to their best efforts to help with the rent. So applying for a state program for rent relief, I think both of those things would need to happen in order to avail yourself of the CDC protections.
Thank you. Someone is asking, what steps must a tenant take to enforce the CDC order when a landlord violates the order? Are there attorneys available to assist them in correctly filing in court?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So I didn't discuss it here, but there are penalties if owners attempt to violate the CDC order. So in the CDC order's guidance, it says that the Department of Justice is tasked with enforcing those consequences or seeking those consequences. And so as a practical matter, how does a tenant report a landlord that is acting in violation of the CDC order? So the CDC doesn't provide a clear process, but those violations of the CDC order, if someone actually ends up before a judge, the violations can be raised with the judge. But in terms of someone being housed and seeing violations of the CDC order, the CDC doesn't really provide guidance about how to affirmatively assert that the landlord is violating the CDC order. And so that will have to be done kind of piecemeal. So like each tenant that is represented by an attorney will have to think through what is the strategy for affirmatively asserting that the landlord is in violation of the CDC order.
Thank you. Another question, does the moratorium impact utility payments that may be due to the landlord?
Yeah, so the CDC order doesn't refer to utility payments. It just refers to rent for the unit. So so in terms of like, can someone be evicted for not paying their utilities? I don't know the answer to that question. But in terms of what does the CDC order protect? It protects folks from being evicted for not paying their rent. So if the utilities are a part of the rent that goes to the landlord, then that person who submits the declaration should not be evicted from the unit. If someone submits a declaration to their landlord and their rent is separate from their utilities, I think that that person would have to have a legal aid advocate or a legal representation to argue that any utility shutoff should not result in their eviction. I would say that in some jurisdictions that they have local protections that prevent the cutting off of utilities. And so once again, that's help. Folks should, if they're facing eviction, should be seeking legal assistance to assert some of these claims.
Thank you. Somebody is asking if there's any kind of proof or supporting documentation that has to be submitted with the declaration.
So like proof of like that someone meets each of the 5 requirements? No. So folks are only required to submit the declaration. I will say that we've seen throughout the country that even where the declaration has been submitted, that landlords are trying to actually challenge the validity of the declaration. So for instance, one piece of the declaration is stating, the person asserts that they will attempt to make partial payments to the best of their ability in consideration of other non-discretionary expenses that they have. So like, what does that mean? The CDC order doesn't define what that means. It just says that folks are going to make the best effort to make a payment of the rent in a timely manner, and best effort is in consideration of the other non-discretionary expenses that they have. So some landlords have been attempting to litigate, if you will, how much of a partial payment is actually enough. So while it's not a requirement to have this type of documentation submitted to the landlord along with the declaration, folks should be prepared to establish why they meet those requirements and how they meet those requirements of the declaration.
Thank you. We have another question. If a lease has a holding over clause that doubles the rent if a tenant holds over after the termination date of the lease, do you think the landlord will be able to collect the rent increase?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I don't know. I would encourage them to reach out to legal service providers, because there are some jurisdictions have um, laws that limit the amount that rent can be increased. Um, and so that's really going to be a function of state and local law about whether that landlord could then double the rent without could double the rent simply because someone stayed over.
Great, thank you. And someone is saying, this is a national presentation, and she realizes that she needs to become more aware of what her state and local impacts are. What is the best way to learn about the state and local stances, protections, and actions? What's the best way to find out what's available locally?
Yeah, so in many states, there are legal service organizations, and they, in addition to providing legal services to folks who need it, they can also do presentations or to present about local and state protections in terms of landlord tenant law. Most states have their the state landlord tenant law online. So you state code is usually, you can find it online. In terms of like local jurisdiction laws, so your city laws, your county laws, those can be a little bit more difficult to find. Not all cities and local jurisdictions have their laws online. But in terms of like getting resources or finding resources that can help explain to you what the law is, so legal aid organizations, they do trainings. They also can provide resources that tell you what the law, about the law and the protections. Also, in some jurisdictions, they'll have like a self-help center at the eviction court. So at the self-help center, they don't go in and represent you, but they provide you resources about what the law states, and potential protections that you could assert. So I think those are a good starting place. And then also in some states, there's like a housing advocates coalition. So trying to find out if your state has a housing advocates coalition. They typically are very informal. So like here in California, we have a housing advocates listserv. And so it's really just everyone's exchanging emails and talking about what's happening in the state. So that's also another great resource. And then, on the topic of legal services, some jurisdictions have a right to counsel. So what does that mean? Typically, if I go before an eviction court, I don't have a right to have someone. So in the criminal sense, if I'm coming before the court for criminal charges, I have a right to an attorney. So I have a right to have someone there to represent me if I want someone. In the civil case, the court isn't going to appoint an attorney to you. But in places where there is a right of, sorry, I forgot the term, but there are some jurisdictions that require a right to counsel in the civil aspect. So I would also say that's another important piece of knowing what the local law is knowing if you have a right to counsel. Because in eviction cases, folks can have access to an attorney. And not to say that in other jurisdictions you couldn't hire an attorney, but in the right to counsel jurisdictions, they have infrastructure for helping folks getting plugged in with an attorney, to have an attorney there the day of, and to take on those eviction cases.
Thank you very much. We had one question. I believe this is the legal services provider. She says, under the new guidance, landlords can challenge the declaration in court. If we are representing a tenant, what is the legal standard? Who has the burden of proof?
Right. So the CDC's guidance doesn't talk about that at all. The CDC order doesn't even state that landlords can challenge a declaration. What the CDC order states is that if someone lies on the declaration, that they're subject to charges of perjury. And so the guidance, as I mentioned before, has not given real clarity about what are the processes for challenging a declaration if a property owner can challenge a declaration. Well, it says in the order that they can. So in terms of the standards, the guidance doesn't state that there are any. And so from our perspective, the courts should not allow landlords to just simply challenge every declaration that they receive from residents. That the landlord should actually have a good faith belief that the tenant doesn't meet those doesn't meet the eligibility of the CDC order. So that's not super helpful, but essentially I would imagine in practice that the onus would be put on the tenant if the courts aren't ensuring that landlords who are attempting to challenge the declaration have a good faith belief that the declaration has been signed untruthfully.
Great, thank you. And just a couple more questions. Is it true that foreclosures are still allowed to proceed during this time? And if so, why?
So the CDC order explicitly says that it does not apply to foreclosures. And so why are foreclosures permitted to continue to proceed? I really don't have a great answer. I don't have an answer, except for simply because the government has allowed them to continue to proceed.
Great, thank you. And this question maybe relates to how the CDC order is different from others. It says if the tenant had issues of not paying rent, issues with paying rent before COVID, could that tenant be evicted, or is that tenant still protected even if the problems preceded COVID?
Yeah, so the CDC order would, if they're still in possession of the unit, then the CDC order would protect them, even if the rent arrears preceded September 4th.
Excellent, thank you. And then I had just one more question since we are over time, and I want to encourage everyone to submit your questions. Ms. Simmons provided her contact information, so you can still contact her. We did have a question about whether the fact sheets and declaration for renters were available in Spanish and other languages.
Yes, so on our website, we have a list. We have the declaration in that has been translated. And so one language that it has been translated into is Spanish. We also have the form in Arabic, Chinese, Creole, and Vietnamese.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Ms. Simmons. I think you're going to get a few emails in your inbox later, as some people probably will reach out to you to have their questions answered. Thank you, and I'll turn it over back to Linda.
Thank you, Nelson, and thank you again, Ms. Simmons, for such a great presentation and for hanging in there with us and answering all of those questions. As Nelson mentioned, if you think of a question, you have her email. She's willing to take your questions via email. So shoot those questions to her. Now, before I move on, if you're interested in making a contribution to Consumer Action, you can do it online. You can do it by credit card. You can use PayPal, or you can mail a check to Consumer Action. Our address is there on the screen. Upcoming events on November the 17th, please watch your inbox. We will have another webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on the mental health of children and protecting children's privacy online. I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. We'll know you're busy, so thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. And Ms. Simmons, we know you're busy over there at the National Housing Law Project, so thank you again for agreeing to do this. So a lot of information. It was very informative, and I hope that you can use it to help your clients. So until November 17th, I want you to stay safe and don't forget to answer that survey at the end of this webinar. Thank you again for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.